are well known to go to many extremes for the sake of their sport, such as doing a new exercise regime or a new diet. Some, however, may turn to medications or supplements in the hopes it'll give them just that much edge over their opponent. Former Orioles pitcher Steve Beckler was one such athlete who, during his spring training in 2003, against the wishes of his coach, decided to take ephedra, then marketed as a weight loss drug. However, the 23-year-old's baseball career and life were cut tragically and suddenly short during that spring training, due largely in part to the toxicity of the ephedra in his system. This case was one of many that finally spurred the FDA to declare ephedra illegal in 2004. And though the ephedra case was probably the most visual, it is not the only one, as every year people's lives are put in danger due to herbal supplements that are otherwise incredibly healthy for you. And this is why the US federal government should more heavily regulate the use and distribution of herbal supplements. I'll first look at the current state of affairs, how exactly herbal supplements stand in the United States today, as well as examine some of the problems that arise because of it. Then I'll give forward a very simple solution, as well as examine some of the arguments against it. First, however, we need to understand just where herbal supplements stand today, and we can do that in two main ways. The first is that we need to understand that federal law covers supplements separately from normal prescription medications. Herbal supplements are most heavily regulated by 1994's Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, more commonly referred to as DSHEA. Under DSHEA, only the manufacturing plants themselves, and not the drugs they create, have to be reported to the FDA. In addition to this, for the manufacturing plants, things like the quality control for the process or the labeling are not very heavily regulated at all. And because of that, the burden of proof for the safety of these medications moves away from the manufacturers and towards the FDA, who are only responsible after the product is hit the market and after consumers have reported dangers. The second thing we need to understand is that herbal supplement use by consumers is actually incredibly high. The National Institute of Health in 2009 published a report that said American patients spend $22 billion each year on self-care costs, and 60% of that is spent on herbal supplements. So obviously, patients believe these things are beneficial to their health. However, because supplements aren't too heavily regulated, there is a bit of a disconnect. And as another 2003 study reported, 70% of these patients don't tell their doctor that they're taking supplements. So the patient's only information is from the warning label. So now when we take these two things combined, the fact that patients are obviously using supplements in high numbers, and the fact that there's very little regulation, we can see that there would be problems that would arise because of that. And these fall in two main categories. The first is that consumers are put in danger by these herbal supplements due to the lack of regulation. And a lot of this falls down to the manufacturers. Under DSHEA, there are no guidelines for the production process. So trace elements like lead can and have been found in many herbal supplements. In addition to this, as long as manufacturers don't claim that something can treat or mitigate a disease, just about anything can go on the label. And this is a huge problem because patients are relying on these labels because they don't talk to their doctors. So this is especially important when it comes to drug interactions. For example, the most commonly taken herb in the United States is ginseng, but when taken with the blood thinner warfarin, can cause internal bleeding. But patients wouldn't know this because many bottles of ginseng do not have this label on the bottle because manufacturers aren't required to put it on there. The real kicker, though, is that the burden of proof is not on the manufacturers for the safety. It's on the FDA, which means while the FDA is investigating whether or not a drug is actually dangerous, it can take years to get a mislabeled or dangerous drug off the market while unaware patients are still using it. The second problem is a direct consequence of this last one, and it's that consumers will then not have access to herbal supplements that are actually beneficial to their health. I'd like to go back to ephedra as an example of this. During the 10 years that it was active in the United States, it was most commonly used as a weight loss drug. However, in the early 20th century, it was most commonly used for things like asthma, with no consequence whatsoever. So obviously, ephedra was beneficial to health, but because manufacturers were labeling it wrong and marketing it wrong, it became dangerous. So consumers no longer have access to these things that could actually supplement their normal health care. So now that we see that our current state of affairs are sort of attacking consumers from two different fronts, it's obvious that we need a change. And this change can be easily accomplished by either repealing or amending DSHEA so that it more heavily resembles Health Canada's natural health products regulations. There will be two big changes when it comes to this. The first is for the manufacturers. The aforementioned burden of proof will be moved from the FDA to the manufacturers, which means that these companies will be more responsible for making sure that the quality of the process of making these supplements will have no trace elements whatsoever, making it safer for the consumer. The second is that these herbal supplements will be split into two categories. The first is traditional use, where these herbal supplements will be marketed and their efficacy and dosage will be labeled according to their traditional use, which you can find in many pharmacopoeias. The second is trial tested, where supplements will be put onto scientific, rigorous, double-blind studies, either to more further prove their efficacy or prove just how another dosage would be helpful. This has two big consequences. The first is that it would force manufacturers to be much more truthful in their labeling process. And the second is that patients will have a much better idea of what they're getting into when they're buying herbal supplements. Now, obviously, there are going to be some arguments against this, and they fall into two main categories. The first is the idea of the safety of herbal medicines. Since the stories that tend to hit the news most often are when herbal supplements are a danger to health, some wonder, why shouldn't we just ban them completely if they're so dangerous? Once again, I would like to bring up ephedra, since it works as a very good example in this case. Over the 10 years it was active, there were 155 reported deaths, which, yes, is a problem. However, when you compare it to the many deaths that occur because of prescription drugs, which can run into the tens or hundreds of thousands, it doesn't look too dangerous anymore. In addition, ephedra was a very special case. It was taken in dosages for much longer and in much higher concentrations than had ever been used in China. So the problem is not the supplement, but rather the manufacturers, which the previous solution addresses. The second is the cost. Some wonder if it wouldn't cost too much money to increase regulations. And while yes, the FDA may need more money to regulate these herbal supplements more strongly. However, first, I have to say that the patient's health is much more important. And second, it's actually very easy to instead redistribute the FDA's current budget. In 2008, Alternative Medicine reported that the FDA supplement division had $10 million to regulate a $20 billion industry. Now, when you compare this with the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, which had over 50 times more money for an industry only 12 times as big, well, there's a bit of a discrepancy there. So I instead push that the FDA should rearrange their budget to more accurately represent what the actual market is. So in conclusion, given that the current state of affairs is causing too many problems for consumers, and that the solution is rather easy to implement, the US federal government should more heavily regulate the use and distribution of herbal medicines. Steve Beckler's case was obviously a tragedy, but the cause of his death was not the supplement he took. It was the manufacturers, who for the sake of a sale, marketed a drug for a use it was never meant for. So for the sake of Beckler, for others like him, and for those who are now being denied a viable treatment option, we should regulate these medicines so that something like that can never happen.